Okay. I think this means we're recording. Yes, I believe we are. Hi, everybody. Welcome to the first live Q&A we have for the AOD and homelessness community of practice. Today we have our presenters. We don't have anyone asking any questions, but we have organised what we think will be a pretty useful and a pretty interesting session for you. So we hope you enjoy it. Before we do introductions, I just want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land wherever you find yourselves watching this video, and pay respects to elders past, present and emerging, and just acknowledging that this land was never ceded, and keeping that in mind with the continuing impact of colonisation and intergenerational trauma that Indigenous people experience, that we do our best to create safe and effective places for these people to come into contact with us. Cool. So my name's Naomi and I'm from VADA, and I'm the lucky person who gets to coordinate these sessions and these activities. And I'll hand it over to our other participants to introduce themselves. Whoever would like to jump in.
All right, I'll start. I'm Olivia Nichols, and I'm called a clinical consultant, and I work for Odyssey, which covers off on the Northwest region. And basically my job is about understanding how people access and the ways the best fit for people that come in through our service via an assessment. So that's kind of what my jam is. Who's next?
So my name is Danielle. I'm from Launch Housing. I'm currently working in service development, but prior to that, I coordinated the initial assessment and planning service in our office in St Kilda. And we also have an initial assessment and planning service in Collingwood and Cheltenham. So Collingwood's the one in the Northwest Lazen. So initial assessment and planning is sort of the entryway into the homelessness service, and we would see anybody who's homeless or at risk of homelessness, try and assist them with an assessment and some referrals or some pathways for them to go to from there. So I'll be here to participate in answering some of the housing related questions.
That's me. My name's Lenka. I'm from Wombat Housing and Support Services. I'm a team leader for 2 of the youth programs. So we have youth housing case managers. We're in the western suburbs, and we also have a singles program, adults program, families program, and a tenancy plus program. So I'll be joining Danielle in talking about the housing sector.
Amazing. Thank you. A wealth of experience here, and we hopefully get to draw a lot of that out of you in the next 50 minutes or so that we have together. Having a look at some of the feedback from the training, there were a couple of areas that people had, there seemed to be a need for further information. So we thought it would be helpful for that to be, for those to be a couple of topics of discussion today. And then for us to have a look at the AOD and homelessness case study that we used in the training, and to just unpack that a little bit more so we get a really good sense of what opportunities there are for both AOD and homelessness clinicians to perhaps do something a little bit different to what they normally do, how to most effectively engage with the other sector, and how to provide the best holistic and wraparound support for people. So I hope that sounds okay. The first person I was going to ask to speak is Olivia, and what we're hoping Olivia can give a bit of an overview on, and this is certainly just an overview. I'm sure there's a lot more that Olivia can explain and share in relation to this, but at this point, we're just going to have an overview, and that's around stages of change and also elements of harm minimisation. So take it away, Olivia.
All right, hello. So I think that the reason why we wanted to go through stages of change and harm min is because there are things that you can do as homelessness or housing workers and organisations. These are things that you can do that are quite simple and straightforward. Feels daunting, but I guess what we look at, particularly I guess harm in you might have heard about stages of change. And how about if I go through that first? Basically, stages of change talks about, I guess, a linear, but not so linear, idea of where people are at with many things, but we're talking about mainly substance use at the moment in this forum. So basically what I'll outline kind of what it is, and people will repeat where they are in the stages of change. So I'll explain that in a tip. Stages of change basically talks about your readiness to change. And there's a number of stages in this story. So you would, for example, it's pre-contemplative, contemplative, action, and maintenance are the basic ones. You can get a little bit more complicated in that space, but they're the ones that we would probably talk about most. Pre-contemplative is, there's no issue, I'm fine, partying it up with my mates, it's not affecting me, even if it is. Some people think that that substance use isn't affecting them, and it clearly is, and that is fine. It's where they believe they're at in terms of readiness, rather than what we believe they're at in terms of readiness. And then they turns into contemplative. So that means, I think that this is starting to affect my life. Maybe it's not so great. I'm getting big hangovers, or it's affecting my relationships, or I'm just starting to notice all of those things. And that's when you're contemplating change. So you're thinking about it. You might be checking out, for example, what services might be available, but not ready to go through and talk about how you might change your substance use. And then there is the action phase, which is, all right, I'm ready to do something. I'm going to reach out and get some help, or to talk to friends, or make a change. And that change can be with help or without help, and with AOD services or without AOD services. There's many ways that you can be in the action phase. And then there's the maintenance phase. All right, so you've reached a point to where you're happy to be in action, and you've probably looked at and you've completed, you're up to a place where you're happy that your recovery is at. And now in AOD, we don't really mind where that sits for people, because some people think that their recovery is abstinence, which it generally tends to be, that people struggle a little bit if it's not. But many people feel that if they can drop back to drinking, maybe socially, and having one glass of wine, or using ice every so often, or perhaps even dropping a few pills occasionally, might be something that they're happy to do, and they feel like that functions okay for them. They might try to do that, and they might put themselves all the way back to contemplative and into other stages, of course. But basically what that looks like for you is understanding where people are at in terms of the stages of change. Because if you understand where someone's at in the stages of change, you know what you can do. So that means, and I think that where housing services and people could do the most work is actually around harm minimisation, and it's also about motivational interviewing. I'll talk about that in terms of stages of change, but also around assisting someone to access services if needed, because access is, it's not something that's always easy for people to do. So basically, when someone's in the pre-contemplative stage, then what you would be doing is providing harm minimisation or harm reduction information, and you might be trying to create a little bit of insight. So when you're doing harm minimisation, what we're talking about is how to use substances more safely, rather than how to stop or reduce. So we're talking about how to use more safely. So, for example, I guess let's talk about injecting drug use. This is more about how to access clean needles, how to rotate your sites. If you feel like you're not up to that stage and you're not sure how to talk to somebody about that, then you would send them to your local needle and syringe program, NSP. And you can look that up online. That's not a problem. The other thing that you might be doing is having a look at someone's injecting sites if you feel comfortable about that, because sometimes they're inflamed and they've got an abscess, and then you would be sending them to a doctor. But most of the time it's making sure that someone uses safely. So for example, with heroin, we're not always sure how strong it is. So it's a good idea to be careful with your dosing. You're better off injecting twice with a new dealer or a new batch. We call it halving a hit, because we prefer to have 2 holes in our arm compared to dead, which is probably a better option.
Yeah.
So, you know, you talk about those sorts of things, being careful, making sure you use with other people. So if you drop, then you know that someone else is there that can help you out. Also, if you're using opioids, it's a good idea to carry naloxone. That's available readily via your local NSP usually, but also via a doctor, and you can get a script, and then you go to a chemist and get it filled. For you and I, for people like me doesn't have for health professionals, it's a little bit more expensive to get it, but it's pretty cheap for people who are injecting drug users at the moment. There are a whole lot of ways that you can look after somebody when they've overdosed. I would recommend that you would go on to Harm Reduction Australia if you think that that information would be useful, because it steps you through all of the first aid. Naloxone, injecting someone with naloxone is super easy. It tells you exactly how to do it. You put it into a muscle, a big one usually, thigh or butt, and you give metered doses, so a little bit at a time, and we'll see if we can get somebody to wake up. The idea is that you don't have to put them in withdrawal, because they'll hate you. They'll probably get up and pop you on the nose, because they'll be suddenly in withdrawal, very unhappy, and they will have wasted a couple of $100. So the idea is that you give it slowly over time, and everybody can do that. It's not a problem. So don't feel uncomfortable about it. In the end, if you feel like you can't do the metered doses, you stick the whole lot in anyway, because we prefer someone to be alive and in withdrawal than not alive. So that's the sort of thing around opioids. With ice, we're looking at a higher purity these days than there ever was before, and the price hasn't changed a lot. So you're getting more bang for your buck. With that, you'd be talking about how you were smoking it, perhaps making sure you've got clean equipment, or how you were injecting your ice. In terms of alcohol, we're looking at how to drink safely. So that means that you would prefer, if you're having blackouts, drinking by yourself is not such a good idea. Trying to put off how long in the morning that you would drink, not stopping drinking immediately or suddenly, because you can have a seizure and die. So it's very strange as a worker to say, don't stop drinking, let's get you into a detox or something. You've got to keep going, which is a very, very strange thing to be telling people if you can see them being a really a mess when they're not sober. A lot of people come to AOD services thinking that they need to, their detox journey starts yesterday, and they might arrive in withdrawal. So that when people are in withdrawal from alcohol, the main thing that we're worried about is seizures and death. So that could be managed, and that could be managed outside with a GP or with a detox and those sorts of things. So, and then you would be talking about, okay, in terms of harm, don't drive when you've been drinking. You know, those sorts of really, because a lot of people you talk about say, don't drive when you've been drinking, and they say, Yeah, I forgot about that. Yeah, they do, totally. But also, if you've got a high tolerance to alcohol, then you're going to have a high blood alcohol level and look like you feel less drunk. So we had someone come through with 0.23 a little while ago, and they were walking and talking nearly just fine. Yep. And so people don't realise that they're drunk either. So in terms of benzos, you make sure that, so benzos is your like Valium and temazepam and those sorts of things. What we're looking at with that is don't stop suddenly there either. If you've been using for a very long time and over and every day, you'd be very careful about how you would stop. But the idea is that you would see a doctor and get that sorted out. Now, one of the other harm in stories is, you know, the usual combining depressants together. So people don't necessarily realise that alcohol is a depressant as well as a benzo is a depressant, as well as an opioid. So you sometimes find people taking this crazy mix of stuff, and of course it packs a punch, and you can find that you may have breathing difficulties and people do die in those situations. And if you have a look at the overdose stats, they talk about prescription medication being one of the biggest factors in that space. So you're talking about not using those substances, you're talking about using them in a safe way. Because sometimes people aren't ready. They're still in pre-contemplative space. They're not ready to talk about action yet. So it's certainly those sorts of things. Or if you're still using, thiamine is a good idea for people that drink alcohol heavily and they go to the doctor and talk to them about that. In the contemplative phase, what you're doing is, okay, they've figured out that it's not going so well for them. And usually by understanding what's not going so well is by, does it affect your relationships? Does it affect your mental health? Does it affect your ability to work? Is your housing stable? And does it affect your finances? And usually they're kind of the things that tell us that it's probably moving into the realm of dysfunctional use. So if someone's looking at those sorts of things, that's when you would create some motivational interviewing. You'd continue to create insight. Probably one of the easiest things is doing pros and cons, which is super easy to do. But motivational interviewing is talking about, usually it's around coaching and goal setting. And that goal might just be talking about a reduction. And that's still something that you're talking about in terms of educating somebody and motivating them. Yes, you can do this. It's an awesome time. You're doing well. You know, no bad stuff. Don't say, "Oh, you're a bad person because you're drunk again." That's not going to set people up for having a positive experience and wanting to move forward, because the shame is already great. Shame and stigma is already pretty big. Now, action is when someone actually decides to change and they start making steps towards that. And so for many people, it can look very differently. It could be, okay, I'm going to reduce my alcohol intake, and I'm going to, we wouldn't say stop, of course, if they're using large amounts or they've got a seizure history, but going to decrease my alcohol intake. All right, I'm going to try to decrease my alcohol intake by half a glass a day and just slowly take that down. Or I might access AOD treatment. Or a counsellor, could even be a psychologist, and not associated with AOD services, because they're pretty good. Many psychologists are pretty good at looking at the whole package. And you might be seeking support from family, and you might decide that accessing AA or NA is a good idea. We don't push abstinence as being the goal. We're looking at what will work for them. And then you would be accessing AOD services. And the way that you would do that, and I'll finish up in just a tick because I've run out of time. The way that you can access AOD services is by making a phone call to a local intake. You know which intake it is by looking on Direct Line Service Finder. And then your client, better to be the client than you, because then there's some buy-in. Buy-in's important. Would do a short intake, 10 minutes over the phone, and assessment will be booked. Usually an assessment happens in this region within 2 weeks, so it's pretty quick. And then you would attend the assessment, and then a treatment pathway is formed. After a clinical review meeting, you would be asked what you would prefer, and then we'd bring it back to you and make sure that you're happy to sign off on all of the referrals, and then the referrals will go in. Now, you'll notice in this process that people short cycle between action phase and contemplative quite frequently, but that's okay. So any little bit, any taste, experience with, even if it's a contact, if it's a good experience, it's a good practice between here and recovery, basically. And that brings us to the end, but I'd be really super happy to field questions and have conversations with people via Campfire. I think that'll do.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah.
And that idea of being able to use harm in as a really good tool for housing workers and homelessness workers, because I mean, we know that a lot of people who experience homelessness use substances as a way of coping and ways of managing some of the stresses and the traumas involved in that. So the idea of taking away a coping mechanism while people are still experiencing a crisis is not ideal. So keeping people safe is obviously the optimum goal in that space. So it'd be great if people do start to use that and you know, to get in contact with you and have a look at some of the other harm minimisation materials. I think when you're talking about stages of change as well, I think we have some resources on Basecamp around stages of change.
I think there is some there.
And I think there might be some harm minimisation stuff. There's definitely some things from harm reduction.
There's a link there. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so definitely check that out if it's something that you think would be helpful.
And you could also pitch a scenario. Don't put identifying data, but on Campfire you can pitch a scenario and we can look at it. Yeah,
good idea. Awesome. Okay, I'm just making notes over here to remind myself. And then what we were hoping to get or to kind of draw out of the homelessness workers was this idea of what are the other supports and services that the housing and homelessness sector provide other than a house, because we all know that accessing a house can sometimes take years. So, you know, what are the types of things that you do in the interim? And it was felt that...
I can do a little bit on that.
That would be great. And Lenka, is that something you could maybe speak to in terms of youth supports as well, just quickly? Yep. And then we can bring it all together by applying everything that we've just heard in running through the case study. So I'm just going to make you hand it over to you, Danielle.
Okay. Well, so this one's a little bit, without a specific scenario, it's hard to kind of explain every possible service that might be available from every agency, because there are quite a number. So even just within Launch, we have 400 staff, 53 different programs at a minimum. And as you mentioned, Wombat's got a dozen, and in the whole Northwest, there'd be many, many more. I think at the conference day, we set up 180 programs or something across the Northwest. So there's a lot of things going on. What I thought I might briefly just start with is just a really brief idea of some of the points at which you could intervene and which there might be support available that isn't just going, here's a house, because as we've established, that's probably not going to happen. So starting from a point where someone is currently housed, but maybe it's not, there's something putting them at risk of housing breakdown. There's a couple interventions that can be done at that point. So number one is most areas have PRAP funding, which is Private Rental Access Program. So that can be used if someone is in rent arrears, and it's most likely to be used if someone's in a tenancy that would otherwise be sustainable, but something's happened. So they were temporarily out of work, temporarily sick. They had a one-off kind of incident, and a short financial intervention is going to get them back on path, and they'll be able to sustain that housing. So that's one thing. Most access points can help you look into. If you are, there's also, I think a lot of time clients and definitely workers, they fall behind in the rent, or they get a notice to vacate and they think, that's it, this tenancy is done, which is not the case. You know, there are a lot of steps in between you're 1 day late on your rent and eviction. There's a long period where it goes through VCAT. There's a lot of steps and opportunities to rectify that. And if the tenant is willing to go to VCAT, which is the Victorian Civil Authority Tribunal, where the housing matters are heard, that they do tend to be really in favour of tenants. They don't want to make someone homeless. So if you can go in good faith and say, I'm trying to rectify this problem, there's often opportunities to solve a tenancy rather than just letting it go. So housing services can also link people with services like Justice Connect to provide legal support at VCAT, or just general information about that process, because people will come in terrified that their rent's a day behind. And actually there's a lot you can do to rectify that, a lot of payment plans, other options. If someone is in public or community housing, there's also Tenancy Plus support, which used to be called SHASP, and they do a similar thing. They're usually referred to by Department of Housing if someone's tenancy seems at risk, but they may be referred to by self-referral, by an agency, by a support worker, and they help people address things that might be putting their public housing at risk. So again, that might be rent arrears, but it also might be, because the rent in public housing is usually affordable, there's usually something else going on. So it may also be helping link them with AOD, or it could be antisocial neighbourhood behaviours, or it could be family violence, or it could be hoarding. It could be a number of things that are putting tenancies at risk, and they can intervene to try and resolve that before it becomes homelessness. Other things you can do before things become homeless is, if someone's in unaffordable housing, you can start doing applications for community housing and government housing. So we know from the data that those wait lists are really long, but there's no reason we can't start putting in the applications before someone becomes homeless. You again might also be able to link with PrAP program around looking for more affordable private rental before the current one reaches breakdown. A lot of there's not that many PrAP workers, not as many as we'd like. So there's a bit of money in that space, but not necessarily workers to help, like case management. However, a lot of what PrAP workers do is something that really anybody could do. A lot of it is very basic private rental search support. So it's things like showing people how to use one form, which is just filling out an online form of all their tenancy history and that. It's doing really basic things like making people a bunch of copies of their ID so that when they go to an inspection, they're ready to apply, that it's already online. Telling people what an inspection might be like so they know what to expect, and helping them role play how to speak to the real estate agent. Little things that make a good impression. So a lot of what PrAP does is just education around what's affordable. So helping people look at, okay, your current private rental is unaffordable. Before it breaks down, let's start looking at what suburbs might be more affordable and looking at what options there are in those areas before breakdown. And with youth, and I'll let Lenka speak to this, with youth there is a lot of support and things that can be addressed before tenancy breakdown. The final thing there, just while people are housed, is probably family violence that Olivia mentioned prior to us starting recording. There's a lot of interventions that can be done in family violence where safe around maintaining tenancies. So we would always want to see the perpetrator removed and the victim survivor being able to maintain their housing if that's a safe option. And their family violence services have access to what is called flexible support packages. So they can be used for things like rent arrears or damages, but they can also be used for things like lock changes, potentially security installations, things that might support making the property safe so that the person can remain at home. So that's always something that may be distributed through a family violence service rather than a homelessness service, but can contribute towards preventing homelessness as well. So I feel like I just talked for an hour.
Wasn't that long?
Keep going.
Yes. Those are some of the things that are in the space of where people are at risk of homelessness. Also, I think we mentioned on the day, but if they're elderly or older, approaching an ACHA program for some support around getting assessments and applications into that longer term suitable housing for older people. So older people might be okay at home now, but there's a recognition that in a year or two, that kind of housing might not be suitable. And getting those assessments started early is another thing that can be done. So if somebody is homeless, I think we addressed quite well on the day kind of what the unfortunate options are. They're not ideal. And in that space, I think for AOD workers, a lot of what can be done to support your client, especially if they're awaiting detox or something like that, is about, it's almost harm minimization, as you spoke about with drug and alcohol, but in terms of the environment. So if they're homeless, sleeping rough, or if they're in crisis accom, like a rooming house or somewhere that is not ideal, it's detrimental. As we mentioned, it's very hard to stay away from drug and alcohol in those environments. Then it might be about how to approach that environment in a harm minimization way. So what things can you do, whether that's through your own use, like how can we harm min your use, drinking or using off-site rather than at home where you're going to get into fights with co-tenants, or those kind of things that you can do to keep your client kind of safe and motivated while you're trying to get them into the detox space. There unfortunately is not a ton of support services in that area for adults, but there are intensive case management programs around if people are particularly complex with multiple issues, and certainly your access point can discuss those. As we said, if they are fortunate enough to get into crisis accom, if that's something they need and they get a vacancy, then you'll tend to find most of the crisis accoms have co-located harm minimisation, AOD, even South Bank has like a needle program, so naloxone training, all of those things. So there's a lot of space to work together in that area. And then, so a lot of what AOD workers can do at that time is making sure applications get started early, keeping people motivated, and keeping them and keeping them realistic, which is a hard line to walk. In terms of once you've got offered a tenancy, there's also programs that can do that. So again, PrAP can also, as well as for rent arrears, it can be used to establish a new tenancy. Get offered a private rental tenancy, there's money there to do it. The same as tenancy plus support. They can also, if someone gets made a public housing offer and some community housing offers, they can help with establishment. So establishment might be furniture, it might be helping people to budget, it might be linking them into local services, whatever is needed, so that once that person is living independently, they're able to sustain that. Let me see. I think I might flip to Lenka, because Lenka can speak specifically about the youth stuff, which there's quite a few different, I think, particularly preventative and early intervention options for you.
Okay, thank you for that, Danielle. Thank you. So where do I even start? So I would say if you're an AOD worker and you're working with someone and they're presenting to you as being homeless, the first thing you want to do is link them in with a youth housing case manager. And the reason for that is obviously we have a wealth of knowledge about what kind of housing is out there. Realistically, we're in crisis in all levels of housing. So just because they get referred to a housing case manager does not mean they will necessarily secure housing. So that's probably one of the things that we want to make really clear, because often we might get other workers ringing us up and going, well, they've been referred to you now, where's the housing? I was like, well, we're looking, give us time, but there's just such a lack out there at the moment. The way it works for us out here is our access point is Unison, and there's also sashes. And so we would be encouraging you to take your client to the access points to get an IAP done. What they will then do is kind of determine what needs the client might have, and they will probably then refer them on to a more relevant service, such as a housing case manager. In Sasha's, there's a group that meets every week called YAC, and in Unison, there's a group that meets every week called SAFI. And what they do is there's like I think 5 or 6 agencies that sit around a table, and that's where all the referrals are discussed, and people who have vacancies then pick up those referrals, and that's how the clients get referred to a case management service. There's also, and once that happens, the first things that we kind of would be doing was kind of determining what their situation is. We definitely love diversion ones where they're in housing, but they just need assistance because they're at risk of being evicted or something's happening or they're in rent arrears. And we like to try and source funding and try and negotiate and keep them in those housing environments, because the last thing we want is for people to enter into the homelessness system if we can avoid it. The other thing is, so they will look at if they're in crisis and they're sleeping rough, couch surfing, etc. We will look at refuge options. Your housing case managers will have access to the resource register, so we're able to see what vacancies are coming up. Most of those have to go through the IAP access point, so we will email them and say, oh, I've seen this vacancy on the resource register, can you please just flick this through for that vacancy. We also look at shared private rental options. As Danielle said, we'll always do an Office of Housing application or a VHR application pretty much within the first 2 weeks with a client, because even though that might not be their final destination, we just get it in straight away, because then they're on the list. And, you know, as we all know, the waiting list is huge, especially if a lot of young people are on a 1-bedroom waiting list, which is a really long wait time. So we just like to be realistic about those options as well. Just because you're on that list does not mean you're necessarily going to get something, and we need to look at some other options as well. There's lots of supported options, like FOIA is a really good model for people who are in education or wanting to get into education. It's a very lengthy process though, and so they would require a lot of support. We would often take our clients and assist them, but I think there's like 2 interview processes, and it's quite involved, and some people aren't really up to that. So it's not suited for everyone, but it is a really good option for some people. I think it's up to 2 years that they can remain in there, and whilst they're still looking at other housing options, and they get a lot of support, and it's very communal. So that's a good option as well. The one that's not so popular is shared private rental. So that's another one that we have to push often, and often there's a lot of resistance to that, and I understand why, and it's not suited for everybody. And like I like to say to clients, it's like, it's not your forever home, it's your just for now home, while we kind of look at some other options. Again, there is a lot of competition in shared private rental as well. So it's about just sort of helping your client prepare for that, maybe help them write a cover letter or something that kind of sells themselves, give them some talking points, just some things that, you know, might help them out, because it can be a bit nerve-wracking. Also, we like to remind clients that they will get rent assistance. So often when they look at a figure, they think, oh, no, I can't afford that. But when you break it down and let them know how much rent assistance they're going to get, it kind of brings it down a little bit more for them. Plus, they also get assistance, like Danielle said, to prep. So they'll get assistance with, or could get assistance with rent in advance. Also, they're most likely eligible for a bond loan through DHHS. So that's another thing that we can always like to remind clients. While this is all happening with housing, a housing case manager is also looking at lots of other support needs. So, you know, if there are fines, we'll refer them to, say, legal aid or something like that, where they can get assistance with some fines or any other issues that they're having. If there's family violence going on, we will be linking them in with a family violence service. Education, we also can apply for education costs through a program called SEEP, which is through MCM. And that's anything from Mikey to some school tuition, books, computer, internet. There's a range of things that we can apply for in that. It's capped, I think it's 1,200, but that's another sort of option. Mental health, we can link them in with mental health. If they're not already linked in with AOD, we would be doing that process as well. So housing case managers, I guess, are a lot more than just housing. We do a lot more than just housing, and we're trying to link people in to services, which, you know, might be a reason as to what their barriers are to sort of find some accommodation. I'm just having a look at my little note here. I think that's pretty much it. I mean, I guess the two main things, though, when you go to an access point, it's good to go with your client if you can. If you can't, I would always say write a support letter outlining what support they need. So we've got this thing at the moment, it's called a BTBR, and it's a brief task-based response. It's just a pilot at the moment, it may change, but at the moment it's up to 6 weeks of support. And that's for clients who are less so in crisis, but are more looking for other sort of one task kind of things like private rental, sort of looking at that, or they need to be linked with Centrelink, those kind of things. If you're wanting your client to be case managed, I would be recommending that in your support letter, and I'll be writing down the support needs. These are the things that I think that they require, because then, as we've said, IAP is so stretched. They have such a little amount of time to assess a client, and often clients are not comfortable or they don't even know what they can get. So if you can make that easier for clients and for the IAP access point, then that's also going to be beneficial, and it will also ensure that they get referred on to the appropriate service. And I think that's about it, unless anyone has anything to remind me of.
That was great.
I'll just add one thing too. As Glenn said, in the west, the access points are Unison and Sashes. In the north, it's Vincent Care, Launch Housing, or Haven Home Safe. But also just to note that Front Yard in the city is statewide, so that is for people under 25. And Ngualla in St Kilda is statewide as well, and that is for people that identify as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander. And the Salvation Army Crisis Centre in St Kilda is an after-hours service. So all of those other ones are open 9 to 5, Monday to Friday. The Salvation Army Crisis Centre is the only one open outside of those areas. So if your client becomes homeless on the weekend or might be homeless that night and you want to give them a phone number and address, it's the Crisis Centre. They'll just assist for one night or the weekend until someone can get into one of those business hour services.
Amazing. Thank you so much. It does still really surprise me how much support there is available. I mean, there were so many services and opportunities for funding, and I guess the advocacy roles that you take there, which perhaps people don't quite understand or aren't aware of. I think, you know, it sounds like there is a lot that you're able to do, particularly in keeping people in housing if they're already there, or even that private rental option. Yeah, that was brilliant. Thank you. Thank you so much. I love the synergy with the harm minimisation. There's ways that you can work to keep your client safe in every capacity. Yeah. Thanks. That was really great. What we thought would be helpful now is just to walk through the case study that we had a look at on the day of training. We've got about 15 minutes left. We may not get through the whole thing, but we thought it would be helpful to go deeper, dive a bit deeper into some of these elements than cover the whole thing. And if we have time in the next couple of sessions, then we can certainly come back to this. I'm just going to pull it up on the screen. Give me a moment so that we can I can figure out how to do it. Hang on. I might not be able to pull it up actually. Oh no, hang on. We'll see. I should have figured these out beforehand. No, I don't think I'm going to be able to pull it up. What might be
read a paragraph?
Yeah, I'll just read a paragraph, and it is available on Basecamp for those of you who want to have a look yourself. I'm happy to email it out again. I'll sort out the sharing thing next time, I promise. So the background is that Jess is a young woman with a family history of alcoholism, moving often and truant from school. Jessie became associated with the wrong crowd when she was 16, smoking cannabis at first, but moving on to ice when she moved schools at that age as a way to form friends quickly and to fit in. So after a family rupture at 19, Jessie moved out and became transient, couch surfing for several years. She continued to smoke ice regularly, a few times a week with friends who also used. She had a string of destructive relationships, oftentimes with men who had already supplied methamphetamine. Jessie began smoking ice most days, was underweight, and was noticing that substance use, particularly ice, was affecting her physical and mental well-being. She toyed with making changes that changed her mind regularly. I'm already picking out some of those stages to change things in there that you talked about, Olivia. So is that an okay start point for you to make some comments?
For me? Or
yeah. Oh, both. Yeah.
All right. So I guess at this stage, so she probably looked like perhaps around when she was 16, you'd call her pre-contemplative, right? It's only, and perhaps as well, when she first moved out and became transient, she may have been pre-contemplative as well. She started to, if you have a look, at the second last sentence, you can't look at that, can you? So Jessie had begun smoking most days, was underweight, and was noticing that substance use, particularly ice, was affecting her physical and mental well-being. Now that fits perfectly into contemplation, right? So she's starting to think that, noticing that it's not going so well, and that that her substance use is important parts of her life. And if you see there, she toyed with making changes, but changed her mind regularly. So she never actually entered the action phase because she never actually arranged to do anything. So she's definitely at the contemplative change stage there. There you would be able to provide some education, orientation perhaps to the sectors, into the AOD sector, but also make sure that she uses safely in that space is probably and creating insight and doing some motivation about actually accessing services. But that's where she's at that point in time. I hope that makes sense.
Mm.
So from housing point of view, I think there's a few things that could be done if services had become aware at that stage. My first thought when she's quite young is that potentially there might have been options for family mediation, and that's something that a youth worker would work with a client on if that is a safe and appropriate option. And then if that wasn't, there's also options there for youth refuge.
Just to add in there, there's a resource you can tap into called FRUMP, which does offer, which does, don't ask me what it is, something.
I was going to say, what does that stand for?
I can't remember. Google it, but you'll find it.
It
offers resources for the family mediation counselling, and then I think you get up to 6 or 10 sessions or something. So that's another option as well.
Great. Okay. Are we good to...
Sorry, and I'm just going to say, so I would think at any of these young points that it would be good if she was referred to a housing caseworker, a youth house caseworker, because they would have, in the thing where she's saying a family rupture at 19, well, they would have looked at refuge options, potential transitional housing property, and I think it goes on and says that, she became a self-taught musician and started doing a course or education in that. So then that's when your FOIA sort of accommodation could come in. But through the very beginning there's just so much that a youth worker would be able to do or assist with in combination with an AOD worker as well.
Okay, thank you. So just following on from that, and you mentioned that Lenka was at... Jessie was also a talented self-taught musician and often also took refuge in creativity. So she had an old acoustic guitar that she'd kept with her since her early teens, in Jessie's early 20s, with some encouragement of youth workers. So there has been a connection there at some stage. She applied to enter TAFE and study music. She did well at her auditions and got in. For the first time in a long time, Jessie was socialising with people outside of her music community. Jessie had decided to quit.
Aha.
Sounds like action.
Yeah. Right there. I guess what you can see from there is a lot of things had to come together for her to be in action phase. And so that, if you think about if in the absence of that, it's going to be more difficult to make the decision to quit, right? So she had decided to quit. And she probably would have at that stage started to look into who and what can help her to quit. She's clearly, and if at your end, what would probably, in terms of housing services, what you could do is help her to access support. Motivational interviewing is still there because you want to maintain the motivation. And then what you would be doing is probably what would be super useful is helping her to maintain those positive social communities. And as Lenka said, talking about how to, she said that there was some options and resources for study and those sorts of things, which might be useful, because we know that if things fall down here, it'll be difficult. It might be difficult to maintain. But yes, she is in the action phase.
Yeah, and just because we're short on time, I might combine with the next paragraph as well.
Sure.
But it did lead on to say that she entered student accommodation and ceased using substances with the support of her AOD worker. So at this point, she's housed, she's linked in with support she's not using. But it says this was a daunting time as she had no furniture, no bed, no money for bond and the first month's rent, and no idea how to pay bills or budget. So in housing terms, that is so distressing to read even a fake story, because there's so much. There's, as we said, there's PrAT money available that can be used for rent. There's Office Housing Bond Loan that can be used for bond. There are multiple services out there that can either use PrAT or things like St. Vincent's Welfare Line or Nils Loan or St. Kilda Mums, even though that's for families. But there is an infinite amount of services out there that probably could have attempted to be accessed to get some of those things that would have made establishing a tenancy a lot more secure. Also just to duck, and a youth worker, a youth housing worker, or even if she was an adult at that stage, someone could have supported her with all of that stuff. So yeah, that's my thoughts on that. I don't like reading that paragraph.
No, it's terrible, isn't it? And with our service, I don't know if every service, I think most services would, in that scenario, if she had been referred to our service, we would still be working with her post 3 months just to make sure she maintains that tenancy and, you know, support her with whatever she needs to maintain it. So that, yeah, that paragraph is a bit concerning and should not be happening.
Yeah. But it's great to know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like it's great to know, because I mean, I think what seems to be a bit of a theme running through this anyway, if we perhaps leave it at that point and we can come back where we dropped off at the next one, is, you know, her isolation and, you know, the just not being linked in and not being linked in with the right services at the right time, and that idea of access is always such a big issue for people. But yeah, like it's, I mean, just even that quick 10 minutes of just giving an overview of where people are at and what can be done, and that there are actually supports and services out there is super helpful. Yeah, thank you. So thank you all so much for your time and your contribution. That was so great when we were looking at that case study, because even though I'm going, oh my God, there's all these things that we can do. This is great. But what we'll look to do is come back again for another Q&A in a couple of weeks, have further questions, and we can continue the case study. But we'll also look at having perhaps some live sessions over the next 2 weeks as well, to just enable a bit more conversation. But yeah, if we perhaps stop recording now, I don't tell you that I'm going to do that. So bye everybody. We hope you enjoyed it. Any feedback, really, really welcome. And we'll hopefully see you all at the next one.
Fabulous. Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.